Welcome to the Chilling Ghost Stories channel. Today we bring you a famous Chinese ghost story titled The Moonlight Mystery. If you enjoy the story, please give us a like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you. Now let's get started.
Chapter 10. A Rare Soulmate.
January 23, 1967. The sky was cloudy, and light snow was falling. Recently, I suddenly came up with the idea of writing a journal. I am a naturally lazy person, and if I wasn't feeling so bored and had nothing to do, I would never have picked up a pen to write about myself, only to later mock myself when reading it. Holding a pen, I guess, is to prove that I am fed up and bored. He went on an internship at a forward hospital, and the two of us were forced to be separated. She didn't dare to defy orders, so she was upset and used the excuse to go back to her hometown. She may not return until before the new year. I heard this move was planned by the tractor to pull Yi to his side, but the decision was made by the department. I have no evidence to argue with him, and I have no reason to fight him. Besides, his supporters are numerous, and even if Jīng Tóng and I rushed in, it would just be a heroic sacrifice at best. Jīng Tóng has also moved away from me, filled with revolutionary enthusiasm. He went down to the southwest to form an alliance, almost taking me along. So, in this vast world, I am left alone. The hospital is very crowded. Recently, the Red Guard factions in the city have been constantly fighting, using all kinds of 18 weapons. I heard that one faction even used automatic rifles. As a result, hospitals have reluctantly become military hospitals. However, most of the experienced doctors at the hospital have been overthrown or called for questioning, sent to remote areas, and some even died due to being criticized. So, the hospital only has revolutionary doctors, but their skills are rather mediocre. Due to the lack of personnel, the intern students became like worker ants. Among the interns in our group, those who didn't participate in the rebellion have been running around like crazy for 3 consecutive days. Today, it's finally my turn to rest for the day. I spent the whole day today reminiscing about Yi. I felt very sad and wanted to smoke, but recently I read a study from England saying that smoking is directly related to lung cancer, so I decided to quit smoking. To cheer myself up, I opened the long-unused record player and played Bach's Violin Sonata in D major. As the music played, my loneliness and boredom gradually eased. But in the dormitory, I wasn't alone. There were 2 rebels, and one timid person following along. They wouldn't let me listen to the bourgeois music. After a brief argument, I thought it would be risky to insist at this moment, but I didn't want to give up the music I loved. So, I decided to take the machine to another place to listen to it. Where could I go? I thought I could go to the anatomy classroom, where there were usually no students during the winter, and I had passed by the building a few times, seeing it empty and cold, just like how I felt at that moment. I finally decided to go there. By the time I left the dormitory, the snow was gently falling. It was already evening, and the ground was covered in a white blanket, like swan feathers. After the coldest period, the weather was exceptionally chilly. In this kind of winter, E and I should have been sitting together in the small restaurant at the school gate, eating hot mutton dumplings. But now, the streetlights only cast light on a solitary shadow. The door to the anatomy building was dark, and I almost tripped on the high door sill, nearly falling. Who on earth thought of building such a high sill in front of the anatomy building? I heard that a large tank of formalin had ruptured a few years ago, spilling all over the school and contaminating the area, so they built this high sill to prevent any similar accidents, though I'm not sure if that's the real reason. When I opened the door, I felt a bit hesitant, as I had heard there were ghosts in this place. But then I thought, why should I be afraid? I was so lonely. Even if I met a ghost, I would have a companion. At least they wouldn't criticize my professors. I placed the record player in a small room facing west, playing Debussy's La Mer. To keep my mood steady, I didn't turn on the lights and sat down, resting my feet on the usual table where corpses were placed. I closed my eyes and let the music flow. At that moment, I felt at ease. While others were rebelling and engaging in what they called the Cultural Revolution, shedding blood in vain, I was relaxing, listening to symphonic music. I should be content. Of course, if Yi were here, my life would be much sweeter. Thinking of Yi, I suddenly heard a soft sigh, very similar to hers. I immediately stood up and looked around, but of course, I saw nothing but darkness. Perhaps it was just my yearning for her that caused me to misinterpret the sound, so I stopped thinking about it and sat back down to focus on the music. The sound of the music spread through the night, and I truly felt at peace, but then I heard footsteps coming closer. They were very light, almost as if they didn't want to disturb my soul, which was wandering in the night, or perhaps they were the revolutionaries rebelling. If they saw me enjoying the bourgeois leisure, would they teach me a lesson? This school had never rebelled against students, but I heard that students from the Institute of Technology and the Institute of Architecture had been overthrown because of their poor background. I should stop the music immediately. Before I could stand up, the record player suddenly stopped. My heart almost stopped beating. Who's there? In the darkness, I couldn't see anyone, and there was no answer. But the footsteps I had heard earlier seemed to come from more than one person. Sweat drenched my palms as I slowly moved toward the lab door and turned on the light. There was no one in the room, inside or out. But when I turned back, the record player suddenly started playing again. It seemed like an invisible hand had lifted the needle and placed it back down. I stared at the record player for a long time and took a deep breath, thinking maybe this would calm me down a little. Then I felt something unusual behind me. I quickly turned around, and I was horrified. A group of people was sitting in the room. I blinked, trying to see who they were, but in front of me was still an empty room and the misty white vapor from my breath due to the cold outside. Who's been messing with me? I shouted angrily. I wasn't lacking in courage. If I were scared, I wouldn't have dared to sit alone in this lab at night. But right now, I felt surrounded by a vague fear. Suddenly, there was a shoo sound, as if signaling me to be silent. In my mind, only one thought kept repeating, run. I moved toward the record player and tried to lift the needle, but it felt stuck in place, as though it couldn't be moved. I then pulled out the power plug, and sparks flew as the plug fell to the ground. But the record was still spinning, and the music kept playing. My blood seemed to freeze, and fear overwhelmed me. I briefly thought that tonight I might lose my beloved record player. Slowly, I extended my hand forward, grabbed the record player, and at the very moment my hand touched it, it released a powerful electric shock, throwing me backward onto the ground. If I hadn't been wearing a thick quilted jacket, I would have sprained my bones from the fall. I realized I couldn't fight supernatural forces. As Chairman Mao said, when the enemy advances, we retreat. I ran out of the anatomy building as fast as I could. Who played this prank on me? I'm sure they weren't ordinary people. So, all those rumors about ghosts, could they be true? My head was spinning, and since it was so late, I was quite disoriented. I decided to record everything I had seen and heard and study it more thoroughly later. January 24, 1967. The snow fell moderately. Early in the morning, I had to go to the anatomy building. The west-facing experimental room was completely empty, so my record player had disappeared into the void. All day I was in the emergency room. Whenever I had a break, I would absent-mindedly think about my record player. I kept asking myself, is this a part of life I must go through? Or is this a phase of confinement, where I must yearn for my lover, unable to meet, missing a friend, and even unable to keep a single item that brings me joy? underscore 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 underscore. I couldn't swallow my resentment, not wanting to bow to fate. Late at night, I went to the anatomy building with a flicker of hope, wondering if something strange might happen that could allow me to retrieve or even steal back my phonograph. I never believed in gods, ghosts, or spirits, and this goes without saying. But if there were spirits, I would challenge them, determined to get to the bottom of it. I stepped over the high doorframe and climbed the steps, but suddenly stopped in my tracks. From behind the closed door, faint music wafted out. It was the opening of the piece Post-Noon Hymn, the same piece I had played on the phonograph the previous night. Enraged, I pushed the door open and stormed into the experimental room in the west wing, intending to confront them loudly, but I stopped, my lips sealed. Inside, I saw two elderly men I knew. One was Liu Tsuanji, a leading professor of pharmacology at the university, and the other was Jiang Mi, the former head of the radiology department of Institute 1. Professor Xi was over 60 years old, and I had heard that he had studied in the United States when he was young. After 1949, he returned to serve the country and seemed to be the one who had elevated the entire pharmacology department. Professor Mi held a high position in the ranks of the reactionary academic community. He should have been subject to political persecution, but because two other middle-aged men in the radiology department had taken up positions as school officials, the younger generation hadn't yet developed the credentials, so he was left in peace. This morning, I had just sat with him reading an X-ray of a patient with a fractured bone from a fistfight during a political struggle. I also remembered a while ago when we had coincidentally discussed classical music together. Professor Mi recognized me, and it seemed like he wasn't surprised to see me here. He smiled and said, "Xiao, the phonograph with your name on it, is that yours? We're having a small gathering here. My phonograph and all my records were confiscated during a house search, and I've been feeling sad because I have no music to listen to." "How did your phonograph end up here?" I angrily replied, "Last night, I came here to listen to music, and then the phonograph was taken. Who knows how, perhaps a ghost took it. But luckily, they returned it." Professor Xi and Professor Mi stared at each other in surprise, both clearly thinking that my claim of a ghost taking it was nonsense and wondering if I had lost my sanity. But anyway, both of them had come to this experimental room, so it was admirable, and perhaps, like me, they had no better place to go. In such a chaotic time, it was hard to find a clean place. There was a lot of chatter outside the hallway. A voice was speaking loudly, "We've listened to Post-Noon Hymn countless times, but we still feel that what the old-timer said about Debussy's structure being in the Impressionist style is very arbitrary. I still feel that in terms of arrangement, the composer has maintained the classical and romantic tradition and its strict standards." A female voice laughed coldly, "I think you're just showing off with odd and outdated opinions. This piece is obviously breaking tradition. Let me point out a few examples. In terms of structure, Debussy has removed the usual formulas, no repeating sections, and no reintroducing the main theme. In terms of thematic combinations, there's no distinction between primary and secondary sections, and many melodic chains are used. These things are completely foreign to the classical style." The loud male voice immediately interrupted, "That's about the form. Still the same old wine in a new bottle. It can't be denied that Debussy was stepping out of the classical style, but at most, we can say this piece is a transition to the Impressionist style. From a critical perspective, it can still be appreciated using the symphonic listening sequence." The woman laughed again, "You're such a classicalist. Listening to music and following a sequence. Do you know who Mallarmé is? The famous poet of the Impressionist school, author of The Shepherd Afternoon, which was set to music in this piece. You've acknowledged Mallarmé as a famous poet of the Impressionist school, and the poetry of the Impressionist school was set to music. Mallarmé himself said after hearing the piece that it was even better than the original poem. So how can it not be considered Impressionist? The booming male voice laughed out loud, exactly. Stick to every line to set it to music, and you can reflect the exact meaning of the original poem. This isn't Impressionism or symbolism. It's just a classical composition method. I stood frozen, feeling that both sides had their points. Professor Xi and Professor Mi were chuckling to themselves. A man and a woman entered the room. The man was tall, around 45 years old, with a well-trimmed goatee. The woman, in her early 30s, had long hair styled elegantly and looked very refined. Professor Xi said, "Every time you meet, you argue like this?" When listening to classical music, what matters is the feeling, not the intellectual exercise. If you think too much, you'll limit your imagination and enjoyment. They seemed to answer together, somewhat apologetically. Professor Xi is right, we have the bad habit of never backing down. Professor Mi also smiled, if you two didn't argue so much, you would probably have been living together long ago. This made the couple even more embarrassed, their faces turning bright red. I had never met them at school before, so I observed them with curiosity. The woman had a pretty face, clearly well-maintained, especially her long hair, which made me marvel. Recently, whether at school or in alleys outside, I'd seen red guards or thugs cutting long hair and clothes that followed the fashion. How did she escape that fate? Perhaps visiting the anatomy building at night was a smart tactic. Professor Mi pointed at me and said, "Let me introduce you to these two. This is Xiao, a talented student currently interning at the #1 hospital. He is also a classical music enthusiast." He then pointed at the two newcomers and continued, "This is Lan Huangti, a leading figure in the maternal and child healthcare department of our school's healthcare faculty, and this is La Qingfen, a top surgeon in the #2 hospital surgery department." They both smiled and nodded at me, and T hesitated for a moment before asking, "Are you two planning to?" He looked at me but didn't finish the sentence. Xiao understood the situation, and said, "This is a serious matter, I'm afraid that the two of us alone can't handle it. We should discuss it together." I really wanted to stay and learn more about how to evaluate classical music, but seeing how everyone seemed so reserved and secretive, I lost interest and said, "It's getting a bit late, and you all probably have plans. I'll take my leave. As for the record player, feel free to use it if needed. Tomorrow I'll go to Jian Mi's place to get it back. It's just that, this place has a somewhat eerie vibe, might as well call it haunted, the record player could be taken away. But since you all are here together, I suppose it'll be fine." Mi said, "Ka Xiao, please don't rush off. I have a reputation for being a counter-revolutionary scholar and am currently being labeled for re-education on the spot, lurking like a snake. I wouldn't dare take the record player to my radiation department. We invited you here just to listen to classical music together. If you're interested, feel free to stay and join us. Actually, we can't do without you. Our record players have all been confiscated, and we're lucky they haven't raided the student dorms yet. It seems we'll have to keep relying on you to provide us with spiritual nourishment." I began to understand more. "So, you all meet regularly, right?" Mi nodded. "It's a long story. We used to schedule regular meetings, but over the past few years, circumstances have changed so drastically that we can no longer follow any rules. I was about to ask more questions, like whether they always met here, and whether they'd ever experienced something like what I went through last night, hearing footsteps followed by 2 or 3 dozen people talking and laughing. They all looked like intellectuals, aged from their 30s to their 60s or 70s, both men and women, clearly familiar with one another. I think I've seen some of them at my university." Ji suddenly cleared his throat and then spoke loudly, "It seems everyone has gathered. Let's begin. It's been almost 2 months since our last meeting, and during this time, the situation both inside and outside the university has grown increasingly dire. Honestly, sometimes I feel I don't have the heart to listen to music or relax anymore. But then I think, the more difficult the times, the more we should seek ways to escape. Music can help us distance ourselves from all the worries, and it's beneficial for both the body and the soul. Everyone nodded in agreement. Me continued, by chance, we recently learned that Xiao, though young, is quite a fan and has a deep understanding of classical music. Recently, we've lost almost all of our records, and Xiao happens to have some. We share the same interests, so we think it would be wonderful if Xiao could join our group. What do you all think? Noticing that everyone seemed hesitant, T spoke up, another student, A few months ago we accepted a student into the group. What happened to him? Didn't you two forget about that? I didn't bother waiting for their approval and said casually, I honestly don't understand what you mean by joining some group or something. I really don't like any kind of commitments, the fewer organizations, the better, it'll be freer. Me quickly replied, please forgive me, Xiao, I haven't explained clearly. What I'm about to tell you, please keep it to yourself. We've formed a small group called Yue Guang Association. The name comes from when we first started, the senior members were sitting together enjoying Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, played by different orchestras, Sneben, Berhauser, Hulaoden, and then comparing Beethoven's Moonlight with Debussy and 4S versions. In the end, we named our group after Moonlight. This was back in 1952. Yue Guang Association was originally a public cultural group. However, in 1957, during the movement against the right wing, many of our members, due to their strong bourgeois sensibility, were naturally labeled as right-wingers. Our group was then deemed a right-wing organization and banned. But we didn't see it that way, we gathered to listen to music, and we were right-wing. We then went underground. Eventually, people found out, and the school kept a close watch on us, creating files on us, and suspecting that we were a counter-revolutionary organization or spies. This made us even more cautious, not recruiting new members, and everyone had to keep their membership a secret. We reduced the frequency of our meetings, only holding them at carefully selected, discrete locations, limiting the number of attendees to 1/3 of our members to avoid complete exposure in case of a raid. The school gradually lost track of us, and since last year, with the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution, the Yue Guang Association became a baseless, stubborn force targeted by the Revolutionary Committee. Because we were just a name, no one knew who the members were, and there was no trace of our activities. Last September, as we were meeting here, a young man, looking bright and optimistic, came in holding a stack of records. He apologized and introduced himself as Liu Jing, a big fan of classical music. His family was poor, although he could afford some second-hand records, he couldn't buy a record player. One evening, as he passed the dissection hall, he heard the faint sound of music, so he quietly entered and saw a group of people sitting and listening to music. He felt encouraged, brought his records over, but when he entered, there was no one around. He waited every day after that, and finally that evening, he met us, and he begged to join the group. Seeing how sincere he was, we accepted him but stressed the secret nature of our activities. He swore to keep it a secret. After a few meetings, he became familiar with most of the members. In late November, most of the members were interrogated individually. They were asked about the Yue Guang Association. Of course, we denied it, but the investigation team had prepared thoroughly and could describe our gatherings from 2 months prior, pressing us to prove that we had an alibi. It was tough for us. During the interrogation, they brought out an important witness for cross-examination. You must have guessed it, it was Liu Jing. I responded cautiously, if there's such a scary past, maybe you shouldn't recruit me to avoid getting me caught up in it again. Ji said, unless you're not interested, otherwise, we have no doubts about you. Actually, Liu Jing may be young, but he really understands classical music. I don't get it, how can someone who shares the same passion for music do something so unprincipled? Maybe he was blinded by the benefit. But what could he gain from exposing us old-timers? Perhaps it's his revolutionary spirit. Before I could express my own thoughts, Ji had already spoken his mind. It was clear that Liu Jing had been a painful blow to them. Dr. Lackingfen said, "Don't you know? That brat might not even realize he's done something heartless. He probably thought he was working undercover, infiltrating the enemy's territory, getting hold of a spy network to trap and clean them up, thinking it was a glorious victory." Ji said, "For a long time, I've wanted to confront him on campus and ask him a few questions, but it seems he's disappeared. I went to the medical school to inquire, and hardly anyone has heard of him." I replied, "I don't think I've ever heard of him either. Maybe he was pretending to be a student. Or, perhaps, he's actually an undercover cop. Then, joining the group." Mi looked at me with a hopeful, encouraging gaze. Naturally, I was eager to connect with like-minded individuals who shared my passion for music, so I gladly accepted. Long Huang Ti reminded me, regarding this, "You absolutely mustn't tell anyone, not even your closest friends, not even your lover or family, because it involves your safety and future. Don't take it lightly." I knew where I had hidden the diary. Even if I wrote here, no one would know where it was. August 2nd, 1967. Cloudy skies. Lately, my mood has been so unsettled that I don't feel like writing in my diary anymore. Over the past few days, I haven't seen Jiangmi at the hospital. I still went to the dissection hall that night, but didn't see anyone. Maybe it was because I was excited it was the night before Lunar New Year, so I went to the usual place to find Jiangmi and Liu Zuanji. The two of them were very worn out. Jiangmi's face showed clear signs of being beaten, and Liu Zuanji was limping, clearly having been tortured a lot. I sadly asked, "So, Ji was also arrested?" Ji smiled lightly, "Just some minor bruises, nothing to worry about." As we were talking, T, Fun, and several others walked in. I felt moved. They, like me, had no family and were wandering around on the night before New Year's Eve like spirits. I prepared to turn on the record player, but Mi raised his hand to stop me. "Don't play it tonight, Xiao. Things are tense lately, so it's safer to be cautious. Right now, you're the only one who is safe, you have to stay safe. We've come to let you know that we're still okay." T and the others had sad faces. I didn't understand and asked, "Does this mean that Ji and me won't be troubled anymore? Has everyone finally left them alone?" Mi smiled bitterly, "Yes. We won't be troubled anymore." He paused for a moment and then looked at me kindly. "From now on, Xiao, don't go to the radiation department looking for me. Even if you come and don't find me, don't ask about me. It could cause you trouble." I nodded in agreement. Strangely, when the two of them returned, I should have felt at ease, but instead, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. So, I decided to get up and write in my journal. February 15th, 1967. Sunny. Since I had no home to return to, I spent almost all the days of the Lunar New Year at the hospital. In the evenings, I would still go to the dissection room, hoping to meet the familiar people from Yue Guang Society. But it was all in vain. It turned out that they were still happier than me, at least they could enjoy the warmth of family. So I missed Yi terribly, and also my good friend Jīng Tóng. Where is he now? Tonight is unusually cold. Well past midnight, I still couldn't sleep, so I got up, left the dormitory, and went to the dissection room with a hopeful heart. But I was stunned by the sight in front of me. Almost all the members of Yue Guang Society were there. Although I wasn't present, so there was no music flying through the air, everyone was very happy and smiling. Could it be that despite the hardships, spring still brings joy to people? I was greatly surprised and asked the chemistry professor standing beside me what had happened. He pointed to the front and said, "Just look at those two." In front of me, a crowd had gathered around Long Huang Ti and lacking fun. Huang Ti was wearing a dark blue suit, standing straight with a magnificent posture, his goatee meticulously groomed. Yingfeng wore a red woolen long gown, made up with powder and rouge, and his long hair flowed down as usual. Both of their faces were radiant with joy, making me secretly marvel. Even though they were both older, they still looked as pure as a beautiful pair of jade-like youths. It turned out that they were getting married tonight. Although I had only known them for a short time, I had heard before that they had secretly loved each other for a long time, but both of them were too proud to confess to the other. They were also both ambitious and focused on advancing in their careers, so they hadn't become a couple for many years. Tonight, they had finally come together, the sweet fruit of love had ripened, there was no other way. I truly felt very happy for them. I felt a pang of longing for Yi. What should I do to help her escape the clutches of the harvester? I congratulated the couple enthusiastically, then returned to my dormitory to take a few vinyl records of Johann Strauss's waltzes. A night like this, full of joy, needed lively, joyful, and romantic music. When I returned to the dissection room, everyone was giving gifts to the bride and groom. Most of the gifts were simply to express feelings, mainly books, paintings, or bas-reliefs. Suddenly, the crowd gasped in surprise at the sound of a cart rattling. An old man, far past his prime, was pushing a tricycle carrying a large glass display case in the style of a matchbox. Everyone stepped aside to make way, and they all clearly saw what was in front of them. I was somewhat knowledgeable, and looked closely. What appeared to be a display case was actually a crystal cabinet. The surprising thing was that inside the cabinet was a nearly perfect human specimen. It seemed that the entire human body had been used to create this specimen. The muscles, skeleton, nerves, and blood vessels were all arranged in layers, creating a cohesive organic whole. It was an amazing piece of craftsmanship, better than even nature itself. But if we called it a corpse, it wouldn't be far off. The display case was eerily similar to a crystal coffin. Who had given such an unpleasant wedding gift? The person pushing the cart was Professor Liu Yuchang from the anatomy department, who had previously been one of our main instructors. His voice was loud as he said, "Most of you here know that I have spent 15 years of my life making this specimen. A prized sword must be given to a warrior. Dr. Feng helped me review the anatomy textbook compiled by the ministry in '56. His knowledge of anatomy has reached its peak. If not, how could someone so young become one of the top experts in our city? This specimen still needs some refinement, but I couldn't think of any other opportunity to present it to you too." Dr. Feng was deeply moved and replied, "Receiving such a valuable gift, I feel so embarrassed." He ran his hand over the crystal cabinet and looked at it for a long time before turning to the crowd. Tears began to flow down his face, and he said emotionally, "I have always been proud and stubborn, thinking myself very talented. I often made mistakes in my actions, and especially over the last few years, I've tasted plenty of bitterness. It's only Yue Guang society that has made me feel the warmth of family. Today, to be paired with Huang Ti, it is all thanks to all of you who helped make this possible. This is my blessing." Huang Ti took a handkerchief to wipe her tears, but she didn't forget to tease the groom. "Today is a grand occasion, and yet here you are, bowing your head and crying like this. How is that possible?" I saw that the moment had come, so I quietly turned on the music player. The spring waltz began to play, and everyone requested the bride and groom to dance. The two of them wiped their tears, smiled, and gladly agreed. They gracefully spun around to the music. I wasn't particularly interested in dancing, but at least I knew how to watch. The two of them were truly a fantastic international dance duo, with Yingfeng's steps as light as a swan dancing on the waves, spinning so quickly it made your eyes dizzy. Huang Ti's long gown wasn't the most suitable choice for dancing, but because of Yingfeng's graceful movements, Huang Ti seemed to glide through space, her soft body moving like hang flying to the heavens, mesmerizingly beautiful. The atmosphere was filled with joy, and it penetrated my soul. I forgot all my worries and couldn't stop clapping and cheering. But at that very moment, I suddenly felt something strange. The dissection room was cold, and when I cheered loudly, my breath was visible in the form of white smoke. But when I looked at the people around me, none of them seemed to have this white smoke. A wave of terror suddenly rose from the bottom of my heart, and I felt completely out of place amid the lively dancing and music. In the past few days, for the first time, I started to wonder, who are the members of Yue Guang Society? Does it have anything to do with the mocking incident I experienced the other day? I again observed the people around me. They didn't seem any different from regular people. Professor Xiao Zhirong from the physiology department was standing in front of me, a few steps away. I tried tapping him on the shoulder, one tap after another, harder each time, but he didn't notice or turn around. My heart began to race, and my breath seemed to choke. Perhaps for the first time, I was truly frightened. But I forced myself to suppress the fear that was beginning to overwhelm me. Whether the people around me were human or ghost, the joyous atmosphere was still real. For the first time in many days, I wished this joy would last forever, without interruption. I quietly left the dissection room. After closing the door, I still heard the music faintly, and the music was still real.